This is the first in a series of videos outlining the proposals called for in Project 2025. This video focuses on the proposed actions that affect the structure and operation of the U.S. government and provides a summary of key components of the United States Constitution against which these proposals should be compared. Points on the slides include references to the applicable pages within the Project 2025 mandate. The Constitution is the rule of law in the United States and the framework for our democracy. Federal employees, representatives, senators, judges, political appointees, the President and Vice President of the United States all take an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Abiding by the Constitution is what prevents our country from becoming one that is governed by a single party or ruler and what protects the rights and freedoms of U.S. citizens. The Constitution defines the structure and operations of our government. Our focus here will be on the branches of government and the checks and balances designed to ensure that no one branch becomes too powerful. As we go through this section, compare its contents to what is happening today. I think at least some of the potential constitutional violations will become clear. There are three branches of government: the legislative, which is Congress; the executive, which includes the President, the Vice President, the Cabinet, and various executive departments and agencies; and the judicial, which is the courts. Article 1 of the Constitution focuses on Congress and gives Congress the most decision-making power. This makes sense, since Congress is made up of people who reside in and are elected by citizens within specific districts and states. Those are the people who should understand best and be able to best represent the needs of the citizens within their districts and states. The powers of Congress include making laws and controlling how the government raises and spends money. Congress is also the branch that has the power to declare war. These powers are defined in sections 1, 8, and 9 of Article 1 of the Constitution. Now let's go to the executive branch, which includes the President. The President and executive branch have limited responsibility. Their role is to make sure that the laws enacted by Congress are faithfully executed. So they are just supposed to be making sure that whatever Congress decided should be happening is happening. For example, if Congress approved a certain amount of funding to a specific agency or department, the responsibility of the executive branch is to make sure those funds are dispersed to that department. The President is also Commander-in-Chief of the military. These powers are outlined in sections 2 and 3 of Article 2 of the Constitution. Article 3 of the Constitution addresses the judicial branch, whose responsibility is to interpret the laws. This chart summarizes each branch and its responsibilities. To ensure that each branch operates legally and within its responsibilities, the Constitution calls for a system of checks and balances. Each branch has checks and balances on it from other branches. In terms of Congress, the laws they propose can be vetoed by the President, although Congress can override that veto with a two-thirds majority. The federal courts also provide a check on Congress. They can declare laws unconstitutional. In terms of checks and balances over the executive branch, if members of the executive branch do something unlawful or that is not in compliance with the Constitution, Congress can remove them from office through impeachment proceedings. The federal courts also have oversight and can declare actions taken by the executive branch unconstitutional. Finally, Congress can impeach judges, which provides a check on the judicial branch. Hundreds of lawsuits have been filed against the current administration, many of which are based on the assertion that actions taken by the government are unconstitutional. As we hear or read news relating to government actions, or for that matter, inactions, hopefully maintaining an awareness of the rule of law as outlined in the Constitution will help each of us to recognize potential constitutional violations and the threat they may present to our democracy. James Madison noted the importance of separation of powers in the Federalist Papers. I just want to read his statement. The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Tyranny is defined in the Merriam-Webster dictionary as a government in which absolute power is vested in a single ruler or group and is defined as a cruel and oppressive government. Currently, all three branches of our government are controlled by one party, the Republican Party. I'm including the judicial branch because the Supreme Court has a 6-3 majority of justices appointed by Republican presidents over those appointed by Democratic presidents. We would really like to think that they would still be independent in their decision-making and not political, but some of the actions that we've seen recently make that questionable. This situation exists at the Supreme Court level, but not necessarily in the lower federal courts. Even if we exclude the judicial branch, the fact that the executive branch and both the Senate and the House of Representatives are Republican-controlled has increased the risk of a government controlled by a single ruler or party. We can see evidence of that now in the stance that Republicans in Congress seem to have taken to essentially rubber stamp whatever the president wants, in their abdication of their responsibilities and in their lack of action to hold the president accountable for his constitutional violations. And regarding those violations, I just want to point out that there have been over 300, I've even read over 400 cases that are challenging the president's actions, many citing his actions as violations of the Constitution. It certainly seems that something is amiss. Now I'm going to jump into Project 2025. Project 2025 is described as a conservative movement to take over the government. It consists of 4 pillars. The first pillar is the Project 2025 Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise. That is the 920-page document that this YouTube series is about. Pillar 2 is a personnel database to streamline the process to appoint conservatives. Basically, it sounds like whenever there are open positions within the government, those responsible for filling those positions should go to this database to make sure that the position is filled with someone who has already been vetted and proven to be loyal to this project. Pillar 3 is an online educational system teaching conservatives how to function in the government. Pillar 4 is described in the introductory sections of the mandate as the formation of agency teams and transition plans to move out at the President's call of So Help Me God. The oath of office taken by the President when he is sworn into office concludes with this phrase. So Pillar 4 of Project 2025 sounds like a plan of action instructing everyone on what they should do as soon as the President takes office. The details are not published. We may never know how or if the current administration's actions relate to the plans called for in Pillar 4 of Project 2025. These are a few statements from Project 2025, and I think these will give you a sense of what the author's goals are and what is motivating them. Our goal is to assemble an army of aligned, vetted, trained, and prepared conservatives to go to work on day one to deconstruct the administrative state. The administrative state refers to the departments and agencies within our government. This statement reveals Project 2025's goal to tear apart the government as it is, or rather as it was when the current administration took office. This has been occurring, I guess, starting when the Department of Government Efficiency was put in place. It is the President's agenda that should matter to the departments and agencies, not their own. This is one of many statements that point to Project 2025's goal to prioritize the President's agenda, giving the President powers beyond those allowed in the Constitution. In order to carry out the President's desires, political appointees must be given the tools, knowledge, and support to overcome the federal government's obstructionist human resources departments. More fundamentally, the new administration must fill its ranks with political appointees. This again refers to a goal of being one to carry out what the President desires. In other words, what he strongly feels that he wants. The last sentence calls for filling the government with political appointees. We have certainly seen that happen already. And what is that doing? That's basically making sure that everyone is going to be loyal to the President and to this conservative agenda. This last statement is pretty clear about how Project 2025's goal is to give power to the President. It states, the White House Counsel must take seriously the duty to protect the powers and privileges of the President from encroachments by Congress, the judiciary, and the administrative components of departments and agencies. This statement clearly shows that this movement calls for the president to be the one in power. To even refer to Congress and the judiciary as encroaching upon the president's powers is not in line with the Constitution, which calls for 3 co-equal branches of government and which assigns legislative and financial power to Congress, not the president. Throughout Project 2025, actions are called for that would withhold federal funding if the state or entity which is supposed to receive that funding is not loyal to the president's agenda. These are some of the examples. Funding for schools. We have already seen threats to cut off funding to schools. This threat was made to the state of Maine for refusing to ban transgender athletes from school sports. In terms of higher education, university funding has been withheld for a variety of reasons tied to the president's agenda, including his agenda to dismantle DEI programs. FEMA and other funding grants to states is also threatened. An example of that is the president's threat to withhold funding for California fire relief unless that state enacted voter ID laws. This next one I thought was interesting. It calls for denying loans to students at schools that provide in-state tuition to illegal aliens, a term the authors of Project 2025 use. That is not just punishing the schools, but is also punishing students who want to go to that school. Department of Justice grants is considered a significant one. These grants are given to states to support law enforcement and public safety. Project 2025 states that the opportunity to support our president's agenda may be greater through Office of Justice programs grant funding than it is through any of the federal government's other grant-making components. The Department of Justice is already putting conditions on these funds that will negatively impact sanctuary states, in other words, states that don't assist the federal government with immigration enforcement. The last example relates to Medicaid funding. Project 2025 calls for withdrawing Medicaid funds if the state requires abortion insurance. One of the things that Project 2025 proposes is the removal of directors of independent agencies. Before we get into that, let's go into a little bit of history of independent agencies. The first independent agency was created in 1887, and that was the Interstate Commerce Commission. The Interstate Commerce Commission was created by Congress to ensure that the regulation of railroad rates was done right. Railroads had transformed the economy and were relied upon by businesses. Congress at the time didn't want politics to get in the way, so they created an independent agency, which consisted of members of both political parties. The goal was independence from politics, stability, and continuity. It should be noted that the terms of the directors of these agencies overlap presidential terms. Project 2025 authors, however, are not in favor of independent agencies and propose allowing the president to remove the directors of these agencies. Normally, these directors can only be removed with cause. For example, if the director neglected their duties or did something illegal. The president has removed or attempted to remove several directors as well as members of independent agencies. Many of those efforts have been or are being challenged in court. There are a lot of independent agencies in the United States government. Some examples are listed here. I want to talk a little bit about the Federal Communications Commission, FCC for short. Brendan Carr is an author of Project 2025 and is now chairman of the FCC. His appointment is an example of the goal of appointing loyalists to lead what are supposed to be independent agencies. The FCC regulates communications, including radio, television, the internet, and wireless services. The potential impacts of a lack of independence of the FCC include the following. Approvals of media merger and acquisition transactions could be impacted by who the party in power favors. The FCC could expedite its work to support companies the party in power favors, and the FCC could affect free speech, for example, by allowing the spread of disinformation such as election denial claims and conspiracy theories, and by threatening actions that cause media companies to self-censor. An example of the impact of the lack of independence of the FCC has occurred in connection with the merger of Paramount and Skydance, which was ultimately approved by the FCC under Brendan Carr. Before that approval, a couple of things occurred. There were two executives at 60 Minutes, which is on CBS, a subsidiary of Paramount, who resigned because they were experiencing interference with the independence of their reporting. This was perceived as an indication that management was trying to please the current administration to get the merger deal approved. Additionally, $16 million was paid by Paramount to the president to settle an issue that the president had with the editing of an interview 60 Minutes had held with Kamala Harris. Many people considered that as a form of bribe and felt that if Paramount had gone to court, they would have won. Finally, Stephen Colbert's show was canceled. Stephen Colbert was a constant critic of the president. Some took the position that the show was canceled because it wasn't good or wasn't profitable, but certainly the timing of the show's cancellation makes this suspicious. After the deal, or as part of the deal, a few things happened as well that are indicative of a lack of independence. Skydance pledged to review content and appoint someone to handle claims of bias. They actually did appoint someone, and that was Kenneth Weinstein, who is chairman of a conservative think tank. They also agreed to refrain from DEI programs, which is another item on the president's agenda. We will just have to see what happens at CBS going forward. Project 2025 also calls for removing advisors, reducing oversight, and appointing loyalists. It proposes abolishing or replacing current members of advisory committees. A few examples of those committees are listed here. Advisory committees provide federal agencies with advice from experts outside of the government and are required by law to maintain a balanced membership, protect against inappropriate influence from special interests, and to operate transparently. By abolishing or replacing the members of these committees, independent expert input could be lost and replaced with input from people who have an interest in getting something from the government. Project 2025 also proposes eliminating and reducing oversight. Again, some examples are listed here, and that includes repealing parts of the Dodd-Frank Act. The purpose of the Dodd-Frank Act is to prevent excessive risk-taking by banks. It was enacted in response to the 2008 financial crisis. The parts that Project 2025 authors propose repealing include provisions allowing regulators to apply more stringent regulations to large banks. Project 2025 proposes eliminating the Office of Immigration Detention Ombudsman. That office has responsibility for legal oversight of immigration detentions. In March of 2025, National Public Radio reported that the Department of Homeland Security cut jobs in its oversight divisions, including this office, and in October 2025, detention oversight was shut down. You can imagine the increased risk this lack of oversight presents to immigrants who have been detained as a result of the recent immigration crackdowns. Eliminating certain reporting to Congress is also called for in Project 2025. This may make it difficult for Congress to monitor the executive branch's actions to ensure compliance with laws and will also likely undermine public trust in the government. The mandate also calls for replacing civil servants with loyalists. Again, examples are listed here. We have seen civil servants replaced with loyalists a lot since the current administration took office. Probably most notably, we hear about it when it comes to the Department of Justice. So what happens if you replace civil servants with loyalists? Well, there are a lot of things that can happen. First, the government could lose experience if staff changeover occurs whenever there is a change in which political party is in power. That is going to affect government efficiency. Second, staffing based on loyalty as a primary factor versus merit may result in a lack of expertise in the areas to which staff are appointed. And finally, and to me most importantly, staffing with loyalists increases the potential for unethical practices. Project 2025 politicizes and weaponizes the justice system. The mission of the Department of Justice, per their website, now that could have changed because the current administration is changing a lot of what they are communicating on their websites. But prior to any recent changes that have been made, The mission was stated as to uphold the rule of law, to keep our country safe, and to protect civil rights. To prevent improper political influence on Department of Justice decision-making, every administration since Watergate has upheld traditions that preserved the independence of the Department of Justice. Watergate was a scandal involving the administration of President Nixon, a Republican, and the burglary and planting of listening devices in the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Nixon's efforts to conceal his administration's involvement led to impeachment proceedings and ultimately his resignation. The independence of the Department of Justice is crucial in allowing that agency to uphold the rule of law above any political agendas. It allows the Department of Justice to serve as a bulwark against corruption from people in power, including the President. Several actions called for in Project 2025 contradict that independence. First, it calls for the Department to make litigation decisions consistent with the President's agenda. All Department of Justice employees take an oath to support and defend the Constitution, the rule of law. Their oath is not loyalty to the President. Examples of the potential impact of having the Department of Justice follow the President's agenda include a lack of enforcement action to protect voting rights, replaced instead with efforts to prosecute perceived voter fraud. A lack of enforcement action in civil rights cases, since equality is an item that does not appear to be important to the President. Cases against political enemies may be prioritized. We have actually seen a lot of this already in the current administration. Examples include the case against Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, who won a case against the Trump family relating to inflating the value of assets to obtain favorable loans. The threat of an investigation into California Senator Adam Schiff, who played a prominent role in efforts to impeach Trump during the first term. The investigation into former General Counsel Jack Smith, who investigated the President's handling of classified documents and interference with that 2020 election certification. The indictment of former FBI Director James Comey, who earned Trump's ire due to the FBI's probe into potential ties between Russia and the Trump campaign. These are all cases that relate to the President's agenda, which includes retribution against those he thinks have done him harm. Finally, by making decisions on what cases to litigate based on what the President wants, illegal actions by those loyal to the President may go unchallenged and unpunished. Project 2025 also calls for the Department of Justice to prosecute entities who engage in DEI initiatives. The mandate also proposes that the Department of Justice take a bigger role in state and local jurisdictions. That includes having the government step in where they deem that state or local jurisdiction crime policies are inadequate, having the Department of Justice initiate legal action against local officials if the federal government doesn't agree with their prosecutorial actions, having the Department of Justice override state and local jurisdiction sentencing decisions, and targeting actions against sanctuary jurisdictions. Department of Justice interference with state and local law enforcement infringes on states' rights. It's also interesting how this contrasts with previous actions that turn decisions over to states. For example, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, the emphasis was that states should be able to make decisions regarding abortion rights. Now, Project 2025 calls for the federal government to intervene if they don't like what the states are doing. Project 2025 also calls for the Department of Justice to take over law enforcement currently handled by independent agencies. There are examples of this later in the presentation. Why does Project 2025 call for this? Well, the President currently has limited control over independent agencies. However, if the Department of Justice starts making decisions based on the President's agenda, as called for in Project 2025, and it then becomes the only agency who can initiate litigation, the President is basically given full control. Project 2025 also dilutes the independence of the FBI, making it accountable to the President either directly or through the Department of Justice. Statements within Project 2025 lead you to believe that the authors are supporting free speech. For example, it states that the U.S. government has no business policing speech. However, what it really proposes are changes that increase the risk of the spread of misinformation and disinformation. I think you will see that based on the proposed actions that we are going to go through. Project 2025 abolishes CISA's role in the censorship of misinformation and disinformation. CISA is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It calls for policy solutions to address big tech's censorship of speech. One thing that I had read was that Meta used to have an independent fact-checking program for Facebook and Instagram. But just prior to Donald Trump being sworn in for the second term, Meta stopped that fact-checking program. That change was perceived as an effort to get on the good side of the new administration. Now Meta is relying on community input to identify misinformation and disinformation. In other words, people using these platforms need to call out misinformation and disinformation, which is certainly not a reliable way to check facts. Project 2025 also suggests establishing regulations that would affect what could be taught in schools. Specifically, preventing the teaching of critical race theory is proposed. In addition, the mandate mentions teachers should not be forced to or refrain from discussion of political issues or other subjects to protect students from what it refers to as ideas with which they disagree. This sounds like it could allow for teaching opinions or conspiracy theories versus facts. Project 2025 prohibits the FBI from combating the spread of misinformation and disinformation. Again, you are seeing misinformation and disinformation specifically mentioned. Finally, it puts the Voice of America, which is currently an independent agency, under the National Security Council or under supervision of the Office of Global Public Affairs at the State Department. As mentioned earlier, the authors of Project 2025 are not in support of independent agencies. The Voice of America is an international broadcaster. Project 2025 states that it wants to ensure that the Voice of America's messaging tells America's story. Removing the independence of the Voice of America allows the administration, in other words, the executive branch of the government, to have control over what is communicated as America's story. We have already seen the current administration's efforts to alter America's story, specifically when it comes to things like racial equality, slavery, and the like. Project 2025 also limits access to information. It calls for re-examining media access to the White House. Consider what happened with the Associated Press. They were barred from the White House press corps for not referring to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America, a renaming that was ordered by the president. There is also an issue with media access now to the Pentagon. The Pentagon is requiring the press to sign a pledge agreeing to obtain approval for all information before releasing it to the public. Limiting press access is significant as it threatens government transparency and certainly undermines accountability. Defunding the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CPB, was also called for in Project 2025, and this has actually happened. The main concern with defunding, from what I have read, is that underserved areas of the country rely on stations funded through CPB as a news source. So this is going to limit the level of information that is available to people in those communities. Last but not least on my slides relating to how the mandate threatens our democracy, Project 2025 calls for reducing election safeguards and protections of voting rights. It removes the litigating authority of the Federal Election Commission, an independent agency, and turns that responsibility over to the Department of Justice. This is an example of what was presented on a previous slide. The Federal Election Commission handles cases relating to campaign finance laws. These laws are designed to curb corruption, promote transparency, and ensure fair elections by regulating how money flows into politics. As I mentioned earlier, Project 2025 proposes that the Department of Justice decide on which cases to litigate based on the President's agenda. If that is the case, and that it is the only agency with authority to litigate violations of campaign finance laws, there is certainly a risk that campaign finance law violations that benefit the president will not be prosecuted, while violations by the opposing party will be vigorously pursued. Project 2025 also reassigns responsibility for prosecuting violations of voting rights interference laws from the Civil Rights Division to the Criminal Division. Criminal cases require stronger evidence, basically evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. That is higher than what is required for a civil case, which only requires a preponderance of evidence. The result of reassigning this responsibility is likely that fewer cases relating to ensuring equality or equity in voting will be initiated. Ending the role of U.S. Cyber Command in efforts to fortify elections is another action proposed by Project 2025. This role was created as a result of Russia's attempt to influence the 2018 midterm elections, with the goal of ensuring that election infrastructure and information systems are protected against foreign interference. So why should you care about these Project 2025 proposals? If you compare and contrast what is being called for in Project 2025 to the U.S. Constitution, you will see the threat that Project 2025 presents to our democracy. 1. Concentrating power at the executive level is a clear violation of the Constitution and reduces the ability of the people to have a say in what is going on. Congress would no longer have the power to address the needs of their constituents. Therefore, the people are losing their voice. 2. Checks and balances are key to ensuring that the rights of the people are protected. The elimination of checks and balances allows all sorts of violations of the rule of law by government officials. Accountability is lost and corruption can flourish. 3. Staffing our government with loyalists is essentially giving the president all the power. Everyone will follow the president's lead regardless of legality or consideration of what the people want. We can see it already. Again, corruption can flourish. 4. Project 2025's proposal on free speech are really to open the door to disinformation and propaganda. The intent to limit access to information and change the narratives is frightening. We are already dealing with conflicting stories, and to really find truth takes work. For the people to make smart decisions, access to truth is required. Non-democratic regimes manipulate their people with propaganda. It is one of the keys to getting power and retaining it. 5. Free, fair, and secure elections are a key to our democratic system. In other words, a government by the people. Elections is where our power really begins. This is being threatened by the actions called for in Project 2025, and I think is something we need to be focused on. 6. The effort to interfere in states' rights contributes to a loss of power of the governed and an increase in presidential power. The potential loss of democracy should not be taken lightly. Once democracy is lost, people have lost their power. So how can democracy, which is based on people having power, be restored? Finally, ask yourself, what kind of world do you want to leave your children? If after listening to this presentation, you have concerns about the state of our democracy and are wondering what you can do, the next video in this series offers some suggestions. This presentation, part 1 of a series on Project 2025, focused on actions called for that affect our democracy. Future videos will address specific policies that affect our rights and freedoms. Thank you for watching, and I hope you come back to learn more.